My name is Andrew Seeley. I'm the president of the Migration Policy Institute. I'm here at Steamboat Springs at having the opportunity to talk about immigration, both why it matters for this country, but also why it's become so controversial, and what it is we could be doing better to get the best out of immigration to this country, how we could manage it in ways that reasonable people could agree on and would lead us down a path of prosperity and fairness.
Welcome to the 22nd season of Seminars at Steamboat. I think you know I'm Walter Abbott. I'm the Seminars chair this year, and it's so good to have you all with us this evening. Today we continue the 2024 season with the 94th seminar in our history. This evening's seminar is the second of 5 nonpartisan public policy presentations on topics that range from climate change and emerging technologies like AI, to immigration and international affairs. And yes, there is a 5th seminar which will be on the November elections, and that will take place next week. The seminar's board members want to express our sincere thanks to all the sponsors and volunteers who make this series possible. Your support enables us to bring you these presentations all at no cost of admission, and it will stay that way forever. We especially want to recognize today's seminar sponsor, Bell Sawhill, and today's supporting sponsors, Anne Van Cleek and Jim Smeeting, and Carl and Helen Marbach. Donations are essential to sustaining our program. No donation is too small. You can donate by going to our website, or you can now also use Venmo. Just go to the Charities tab and look for @Seminars at Steamboat. Video recordings of all seminars are available by going to the seminar's website or by searching YouTube. Starting this year, closed captioning is available not only in English, but now also in Spanish. Please share the link to these recordings with friends and colleagues. Podcasts of all seminars are available at KUNC Public Radio of Northern Colorado. You can link to the podcasts, and you can also see the videos by going to shows and podcasts at their website, kunc.org. Now, I hate to disappoint you, but tonight there will be no audience photograph. Our AI app was just not up to the task of counting hits. So what else is new? And now here to introduce this evening's speaker and to moderate the following Q&A session is Seminar's board member, Anne Van Cleek.
Hi, and thank you all for being here. I always have this little challenge with height and microphones. So did anybody see that amazing rainbow circling the sun today? It was unbelievable, just absolutely unbelievable. They're very rare, and it was huge, and it was a complete circle. So I heard it means that a big storm is coming, so we're gonna have a powder day tomorrow. Of course, this valley was originally inhabited by the Ute Indians, and they have a different perspective on this very rare occurrence of the rainbow all the way around the sun. And they think it means that white man's gonna go home, and there's finally gonna be affordable housing in the Yampa Valley. So I had the pleasure of having dinner last evening with our speaker and his lovely daughter, Lucia, who's here with him. And since they were out west, they decided to enjoy some sights. They flew into Denver on Friday and rented a car and said, well, we're out west, let's take, a little road trip and let's go to, they went to Mount Rushmore. I was like, really? So, we've all been there, those of us who are permanent or part-time residents in Steamboat. So I think you can put Mount Rushmore on your list of sites for your house guest visitors who might want to go off and enjoy something on their own for a few hours. Now that you know, if you're going to Steamboat, why not go to Mount Rushmore? So I know Andrew and his daughter are undaunted by distances, and both of them are great fun to have dinner with, but my committee that also included board members Neil Best and Tyler Gibbs, who are both here, we invited him to Steamboat without even knowing those amazing qualities. He absolutely topped our list of world-renowned, cutting-edge thinkers and policy influencers as we did our research for tonight's seminar on the root causes of immigration at our southern border. So Dr. Selle has been the president of the Migration Policy Institute for the past 6 years. He is also an adjunct professor of public policy and of foreign service at Georgetown University. Prior to joining the Migration Policy Institute, he had a 17-year tenure at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and there he was the founding director of the Mexico Institute and the center's executive vice president. Andrew started his career working with migrant youth in Tijuana with the Mexican YMCA. He later held national and international positions on YMCA boards and executive committees. He was subsequently a congressional staffer working on US-Mexico border issues. His research focuses on migration globally, but he has a specific interest in immigration policy in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The very highly respected publishers for his recent and forthcoming books, and the many, many prestigious outlets for his public opinion articles are listed in your program. Selle received the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2017. This is one of the highest scholarly distinctions in the social sciences. He also recently received the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, and this recognizes stellar accomplishments in immigration policy making as well as exemplary service to society. In this election season, opinion polls show that voters' concern about immigration is second only to their concern about the economy. So, put very simply, understanding the root causes of immigration at our southern border and how to best address them just could not be of more profound current importance. We are so honored and delighted to have as our speaker this afternoon someone so uniquely qualified to illuminate this topic for us. So without further ado, Dr. Andrew Selle.
Thank you, Anne. It's great to be here this evening. Thank you for the invitation. Anne, thank you for the wonderful introduction, and to you and Jim for being our hosts here, and lovely dinner last night. And to Bell Sawhill. Is Bell Sawhill here? Yes, thank you also for being a sponsor. Great to see you again. I always remember we spent 2 hours in a car going to a conference actually in Sea Island, Georgia, I believe it was. So yes, we'll talk about that later. And of course, I've read you extensively, so also wonderful to see you for that reason. Let me, and thank you to Walt and everyone, obviously in Steamboat Seminars for the invitation to be here. I wasn't going to do this, but let me do this to start off, just because I think it sort of helps set the mood a little bit, which is, how many people here were born in another country, i.e. are an immigrant? Okay. How many people have a spouse? Keep your hands up. If once you've raised it, keep it up here. How many have a spouse who is an immigrant? or a partner, or whoever, significant person in your life. How about a parent who is an immigrant? Yeah, how about an in-law who is an immigrant? Okay, that's a lot of hands here. Okay, we can take them down now. We could keep going further. Coworker, neighbor, close friend. We could go through. But immigration is really embedded in American society, right? I mean, we're talking about something that is fundamental. Clearly, this is, as Anne just reminded us, there were people here before people started immigrating here. But even native people in this country have an immigration history, right? I mean, there is an incredible immigration history of native peoples just much further back. But almost everyone in this country has been touched in some way or another by immigration, right? That is, I mean, slavery, forced immigration also in some cases. It was not always a choice. But people coming from one place to another is not only part of human history, but it also is very much part of what has made this country, right? And there have been constant debates about immigration in this country, right? You can go back, we'll probably get into this at some point tonight, you can go back and think of all the different moments whether either immigration has been sought out and people have talked about how important immigration is for the country, or people have pushed back, or it's been contentious, or people wanted immigrants from here but not from there, or this kind but not that kind. I mean, it's part of the constant conversation and debate in American society. And for those who are watching the terrible moment when Donald Trump was shot at over the weekend, he was of course talking about immigration, right? And he's made it a centerpiece of his. I don't think it had anything to do with why he was shot, but it was. I mean, you'll see that moment that is sort of ingrained in all of our minds as a terrible moment, and wherever you stand politically, I mean, we violence in American politics is something we don't want. Something we should condemn. But that moment, he actually was talking about immigration, as he often does. And there's a lot of people that support Donald Trump because of his views on immigration. There's a lot of people who would never vote for Donald Trump because of his views on immigration, right? And this has become, it seems like this has become one of the most polarized issues in American society. And it certainly has among politicians and activists. But it turns out that if you actually look at public polling, and there was a great rash of public polling in a 2-month period. We had Gallup, the Wall Street Journal, AP Norc, and Pew Research Center all did pretty detailed polls on people's views on immigration. And they all came out with exactly the same thing, which is that Americans overwhelmingly are in favor of immigration. They know that immigration matters for American society. They like the immigrants they know. Some of them are immigrants. A lot of Americans are immigrants. But they are worried about the border and deeply concerned about chaos at the border. And people hold both of those views. And yes, there are some people who absolutely hate immigrants out there. There are some people who are racist and xenophobes. There are people who think they're being replaced. That exists. But most people see immigration as something that is positive for American society. It's actually a fairly broad consensus, and it's somewhat unusual. There are a few other countries where this comes up consistently in polling, Canada and Australia and others, but actually it's somewhat unique. In the United States is among a small number of countries where immigration actually is less controversial. People sort of assume immigration is, most people, again, with some exceptions, most people assume immigration is actually part of this country, right? It's always been part of this country. We can agree, again, on who and what levels and higher skilled or lower skilled or, what sectors of the economy, but people generally assume we want immigration in this country. We need some form of immigration in this country. And at the same time, people want to know how the people are coming in an organized and orderly way. And it turns out that that cuts across partisan divides. Yes, there's a little bit of difference between Democrats and Republicans, it turns out, if you look at the numbers, but it's not as vast as it sometimes seems from what you hear in the press. What you hear in the press are politicians and advocates who tend to be on one side or another of this. But actually, average people want to know that people want immigrants to come, think immigrants contribute to American society, but want to know that they're coming in an orderly way and are concerned that they're not coming in an orderly way right now because there isn't an orderly process. And generally speaking, we'll come back to this in a bit, the public is not wrong. Immigrants continue to be immensely part of the secret sauce that makes America function, right? It is part of the innovation and entrepreneurship. Immigrants lower crime, as it turns out. Immigrants improve education, improve fiscal finances. All of that is true. That continues to be just been true for a long time. It continues to be true. They learn English. They integrate pretty well in American society. Their kids really integrate, become truly American. This has held true for a long time, and probably those integration processes have actually been sped up. We'll talk a little more about this in a bit. At the same time,
It's also true that when immigration isn't planned and large numbers of people come in an unauthorized way across the border, that it does create real pressures in the short term, especially for local governments and for fiscal finances. It is really hard for schools. It has an impact on healthcare facilities. And it makes people wonder, can we control immigration? Like, how are we making these choices? And it undermines the credibility of the immigration system and makes people less willing then to think about legal immigration. So we'll come back to all of that. But first of all, let me start off by saying, so what is going on? Why is this becoming such an issue now? And then we'll come back to a little bit of the state of play. This is like a play in 4 acts, if you want. So Act 1 was setting the stage. Act 2, we're going to talk a little bit why now. 3, we're going to talk a little bit about, okay, what does it mean? How is immigration working out in American society right now? And 4, we're going to try and put it together and think forward on what sort of policy solutions are out there. And where could reasonable people who fit into this middle ground where most Americans are, where could we actually agree? If we could sort of calm the noise around us, take the fireworks out of this, and we could sit down and begin to have a rational conversation, where could reasonable people agree we could move forward? So, but Act 1 is done, we'll go into Act 2 here. So why is this going on now? There's at least 4 factors, and these are not necessarily unique to the United States, by the way. You will see anyone from Europe here, or anyone hang out in Europe a lot, anyone travel in Europe, you'll see a lot of the same debates are going on in Europe. They're going on to a lesser degree in some other countries. Anyone's Canadian here, you'll see some slight echoes in Canada as well. I mean, this is not unique. But there are 4 factors, I think, that explain why immigration is becoming such a big issue in this country, but also in several other places around the world. One is demographics, which is to say, most countries in the world are growing older, right? Which is a good thing, by the way, right? When countries develop, people stop having as many babies, right? Women start working, children don't die when they're young. This is a good thing, by the way. Children stop dying at an early age, when the early things, because of healthcare, because of soap. Right now, when people say, oh my God, Africa's exploding with lots of overpopulation, you go, yes, but that's actually a good thing. It has some negative consequences, by the way, but that's the sign the babies aren't dying, right? They're growing up to be teenagers, going to the workforce. It creates a problem because at this point, people in Africa, in most countries in Africa, there's too many young people for the jobs that exist. That's true. But it's a symptom of a change in healthcare. Over time, it's also a symptom of urbanization, and it's a symptom of women entering the workforce, where you'll start to see the numbers then drop, right? Women will decide they don't want as many kids because they're in the workforce, and you will see as people move to urban areas, they don't want as many kids as in rural areas, right? If you rewind about 200 years, if you rewind 100 years, instead of Africa, we would be talking about Italy. Remember those large Italian families? Anyone of Italian background here, by the way? I'm sure there's quite a few people. Yes, those large Italian families. By the way, Italy, I think, has the 2nd lowest birth rate in the world right now. Italy is facing a massive crisis in the labor force right now. Only after, I believe it's either Japan or Korea. It's the 3, Japan, Korea, and Italy are the 3 lowest birth rates in the world right now of major countries. Italy just passed a major immigration reform, and this is under a right-wing government, quite far-right government, which has been, Meloni, who's been Prime Minister Meloni, who is, say stop the boats, but also realizes that they need workers because Italy has a very low birth rate, right? And in the north of Italy, they don't have enough workers, and so they actually need workers. Well, this is happening in most industrial countries, right? Right now, we're at a point, if you go back 100 years, Italy, if you go back 200 years, it was Sweden, by the way. Yeah, no one thinks about anyone Swedish, Scandinavian background? My mother was Danish, so, I'll raise my hand on that. Oh, okay, I see another hand up there. We'll talk later, good. Back 200 years ago, we were the problem, right? 200 years ago, lots of people were leaving, Sweden and Denmark and Norway, huge overpopulation. This kind of goes in cycles, right? And countries develop, then the birth rate goes down. However, it has now gone down in the industrial world enough that we're below replacement rate, right? In most industrial countries, right? In the US, I think it's 1.6 children per woman, which is how they measure it. Replacement rate's about 2.1. That means your population starts to shrink unless you have immigration, right? That's a problem. Now, there are ways you replace workers through technology, through increased innovation. It is not necessarily true that if the number of workers goes down, your workforce is in trouble. There are ways of dealing with it. But that only gets you so far, right? And it only gets you so far in paying taxes, right? Because people who are of working age are the ones paying the taxes. So you also begin to have problems when you have the age pyramid begins suddenly to be highly skewed to older ages, right? One of the effects of this, obviously, is that there are jobs open. If you look at, Wall Street Journal occasionally publishes this, about 7 to 10 million jobs have been opened, depending on the month, in the past few months. Some of this is the COVID recovery. Some of this is that the economy came out of the COVID doldrums and has done really well. But some of this is long-term aging in the United States, right? And that there just aren't enough people of working age to fill jobs. And I occasionally get to, as Lucia, my daughter, knows, I tend to talk to people all the time. And so occasionally I will end up talking to folks at the border or on airplanes who are recent migrants to the US. And I'm always surprised. I've spent a fair amount of time at the border recently. One of the things you find is that almost all people know either what job they're coming to, or they know who's going to hook them up for a job. When people are coming to the United States, generally speaking, they have a sense, it's either their cousin who says, look, right now they're looking for people in the restaurant where I work, or they're at the construction company where I'm working, or they actually know. I've actually had migrants who arrived unauthorized tell me, yeah, I'm going to be working for this guy at this carpentry shop in Texas. Literally that specific. They often know exactly what job they're going to. So one of the things that is going on in the United States, but it's also going on in Europe, is that people are coming because they know their jobs. What we sometimes call the pull factor, right? And this is going to go on for a really long time. And we don't have, I'll come back to this in a second, we don't have the legal pathways for people to come, so people are finding other ways of coming, right? They're around. So the pull factors really matter. And we're headed into a future where we will see a lot more migration. Migration has actually gone up slowly over the past 20 or 30 years, 20 or 40 years. It's gone up by about 50% over a 40-year period, which is something, but it's slow. About 3% of the world's population lives in a country where she or he was not born, okay? So 3%, 97% of people live in the same country where they were born. But we should expect these numbers to go up over time. And we should expect them to go up because there will be parts of the world where there will be excess labor, where there will be people who are coming of age. That's particularly true in Africa, some parts of Central America and the Caribbean, some parts of Southeast Asia, and then most of the rest of the world, but not all of Southeast Asia, but then most of the rest of the world that actually is going to need workers, right? And people are going to move one way or another, right? And they're going to move as much for pull factors as for push factors. And so one of the things that is going on now, and I think it's probably the most important thing going on, when you interview migrants, their story is always about why they left, right? But the reality is, and there's a good economist actually at the Center for Global Development who just did a study of this, that the strongest correlation actually seems to be cycles in the US economy when immigrants come. The pull factor really matters. So that's number one. Number two, the push factors also do matter, and the push factors are changing. And there have always been push factors. Look, there's always been reasons why people would do better to move somewhere else, and people have always moved throughout history so they can do better, right? There's always been conflict. I'm not in the camp. There's some people that say there's more people displaced now than ever before. I tend to doubt that, right? I mean, you can, any historians here, amateur historians or actual academic historians, that the history is filled with conflict. So I would not dare to say that there's more conflict now than there has been at other times. But conflict is changing. That's certainly true. We are seeing more the rise of organized crime in some places. This is particularly true in the Western Hemisphere, where drug trafficking has led to the rise of organized crime groups that now do more than drug trafficking, and where often states are not capable of controlling them. We have seen conflicts where states melt down. Think of Nicaragua and Venezuela. There are 7.5 million Venezuelans, a quarter of the population of Venezuela, has left that country since 2013. And they're almost all living in Latin America and the Caribbean. Yes, there are a few of them that are living in hotels in New York and Chicago. That is true, and in shelters. But the vast majority, 3 million are living in Colombia. There's 1.5 million in Peru. There's 500,000 in Chile, 500,000 in Ecuador, 500,000 in Brazil, and on and on. Most have stayed in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's a large number in Spain, a large number in the US as well, but primarily stayed in nearby countries. Venezuela is a country that's simply melted down. Haiti is a country that's melted down. But people would have left in larger numbers if it weren't an island, right? And being an island has made it hard for people to get out. But it is a country where at some point you may see people getting on boats, right? We were talking about Haiti last night. Unless there's a solution or at least a partial stabilization, that's the kind of country people leave. And then climate is adding to this. And climate, I tend to be suspicious when people say there'll be lots of climate refugees. Generally, people don't tell you that they're leaving because of climate. What happens is people who live precarious lives find that their lives become more precarious as the climate changes. And this is particularly true. Lucia and I spent some time in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, and I've been going there a lot the last few years. And at one point I was trying to figure out how people understood climate change, and I kept asking people about climate, and everyone kept looking at me like I was crazy, because people don't think in terms of climate change. It took me about 24 hours to realize that I should ask people about water. Right? And as soon as I started asking people about water, they said, oh, water, right? No, it's crazy. Water's always been a problem, right? But now we keep getting these hurricanes. They're more often than they used to be. But then a year where the hurricane is followed by a dry season, and so we're just not sure what to do. When someone leaves, are they leaving because of climate change, because it was a bad harvest? Maybe they would have left anyway, right? But there's a good chance that climate is at least aggravating other things. The global inequalities that exist that make people want to move, right, which have always existed, that make people want to move, but it's making precarious lives more precarious, right? And in some cases, people get indebted at the beginning of a season, and then at harvest time, if they aren't able to make the money back, they suddenly realize the only way I could actually do better and pay this back is to move, right? And if they have to, they move within their own country. Most people actually move within their own country. But if they can, and usually if you're Central American, that means if you know someone in the US who can help you pay for a smuggler, who can help you pay for part of the journey and can give you a couch to sleep on and can help hook you up for a job, then you're a lot better off doing that, right? Otherwise you go to Guatemala City or San Salvador, Tegucigalpa. But if you can move further, if you can move across the international border because you have some connection, you'll do that. So I think it's worth thinking about how conflict and climate are accentuating what already exists, right? People there are always some people who could do much better. In fact, most people will do much better crossing the international border and living somewhere else, right? Most people never do it, but these are two things that probably accentuate the push factors, what we often talk about, the push factors. The third thing going on is technology and transportation, which are really changing over time. Remember, Lucy and I were laughing about this in the car, like, what the heck did we do before the advent of the smartphone? And we were talking about this last night as well, too, and Jim. What did we do before this thing, right? How did you have, hybrid work, right? How did you, hang out in Steamboat Springs and be working in Texas or across the country? But this has also completely transformed the way people move. So I was registering Lucia for school the other day, and I ended up translating for a Venezuelan couple, and we got to talking. We were basically just helping translate as they're registering their kids for school. And after a while, I said, where are you from? And they told me their story. Venezuelans would move to Peru, and they told me why they had left, and they moved on. And I said, how did you make it to the United States? And the guy pulls out his cell phone and says, with this. And I said, WhatsApp or YouTube? And he's like, no, GPS. GPS. There are a million ways to move with this thing, right? A lot of people use WhatsApp groups, right, among other people who've made the journey. First of all, they find out from their friend, but they're finding out now in real time. It's not the letter that you would get months later, right, telling you how they went, and they probably wouldn't tell you everything. Now in real time, people are sending you and saying, I made it through the Darien Gap. I made it up to the United States. I got across the border, and you type back and say, how did you get across the Darien? No, I talked to so-and-so who helped. I paid him $150. He walked me through. Oh, okay. How did you make it to the U.S.? You're better off going to Hermosillo instead of going over here. Right. In real time, people can learn to navigate. And they can learn to navigate. You can be sitting in Senegal and Cameroon and find out that start to think it's probably hard to get to Europe, which is where you thought you might move. But you've got a cousin or a neighbor or someone, a cousin's friend, who made it to the United States, and start to send them a WhatsApp and say, how did you make it? Tell me how you did this journey. And people and smugglers adapt to this. We often think of smugglers as generating migration, but the reality is, and smugglers are not insignificant, but most people that are moving do not have a smuggler from point to point. Only the wealthiest people, only the most well-off, or people who have someone in the US. Central Americans still sometimes do have a smuggler from point to point because their system's set up where a quarter is paid by the first quarter of the cost is paid by someone living in the United States. But most people don't have a smuggler from point to point. They're buying the services of smugglers they need along the way, and they're navigating the rest of it on their own, you know. And there are, if you start looking for it on the internet, you'll find all sorts on YouTube, and you can get into WhatsApp groups. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that YouTube's a good one. You can find all sorts of videos about how to cross the Darien Gap, or how to get from Ukraine to the United States. At one point, a colleague who actually works for the State Department, but speaks Ukrainian, said, I want to show you this. And he actually showed me and translated as we went a 6-minute video explaining how to get from Ukraine to the United States before there was a pathway to do that, right? You can figure this out for lots of ways. This has transformed how people move, but so too has transportation, right? For the Western Hemisphere, the Darien Gap is the Darien Gap, right? 60 miles, give or take, between Colombia and Panama, inhospitable jungle, the only place where the Pan American Highway doesn't go because they just couldn't figure out a way of building it there. And for years, it was the barrier that meant that mostly Mexicans and Central Americans came across the US-Mexico border. Once in a while, people would fly into Mexico and make their way north, and periodically there'd be different groups that would figure out how to do this. But generally speaking, most of the people who came to the border came from Mexico and Central America because the Darien Gap was this natural barrier, right? Yes, there were periods of Cubans and Haitians coming on boats, and there were periods of Colombians and Brazilians flying into Mexico and then coming up north. But generally, it was pretty hard. Well, starting right before COVID, people started to actually create a pathway through the Darien Gap. And people who are, I don't know if you call them smugglers, because I don't think they call themselves smugglers, but local people began to figure out they could make money by helping people navigate parts of the route across that, the folks that knew how to do this. And sure enough, you can now get through the Darien Gap in a few days. Now, it's still very dangerous, but it's not as dangerous as it was at the beginning, as it was in 2018, 2019. This means that all those Venezuelans, all the 6.5 million Venezuelans that stayed in Latin America and the Caribbean, they are 7.5 million that left altogether, 6.5 million stayed in Latin America and the Caribbean, they can suddenly think about, oh, wait a minute, would I be better off living in the United States than, say, in Colombia, where I've been living the last few years, or in Peru or in Ecuador? But it also means that someone can be sitting in Cameroon and say, wow, okay, I can't get into Mexico anymore because they're asking for visas, but I can still fly to Brazil. There's a flight through Luanda and Angola that gets me to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and then I can make my way up. So you suddenly see people from South Asia, China, large number from China right now. Actually, one of the, I don't know how to say it's amusing, but sort of an interesting scene. We managed to be in Brownsville, Texas, the week that the Chinese migrants started arriving in large numbers because China had taken off the quarantine on travel. And in one day, we saw Border Patrol agents trying to line up a group of Chinese nationals who they were releasing, but realized that none of them could speak Chinese. And they were laughing and said, look, we speak also, we know how to say, the basic things in Haitian Creole. We all speak Spanish because half of us are, Mexican background. We know a little bit of Ukrainian and Russian, but we never thought to learn Chinese. And we went to the main NGO that was actually processing the same group. We saw them a few hours later. And they said the same thing. They said, we've got materials in every language you can imagine to help migrants move on, but we never thought people from China were going to be coming. And so we have absolutely no idea what to say. I mean, they were taking out Google Translate and trying to communicate. But there is an incredible ability. We are now dealing in a world where people can move in ways that we never predicted. And these patterns can change very quickly, right? So there's an unpredictability built into this. Fourth thing, we have outdated policies. Policies change very slowly, and I'll come back to this later. And it's good that this is in there in the list because the other three things are hard to change, by the way. The other three things are things that are happening. Policies you can actually change, right? As Bel Sahil knows, we try and influence the way people think about policy in hopes that actually policies will catch up. But right now, in most countries that migrants would want to come to, and that includes the United States, probably it's still the top country that people want to come to. But also in Europe, also Canada, also the Gulf states, also East Asia, also countries like Thailand, by the way. Thailand is a country that has a very low birth rate, by the way, even though it's not a fully developed country. It's sort of an upper middle income country. And maybe even middle income country. None of us have really figured out how to create legal pathways that meet the labor needs we have. And so you have employers who are willing to hire people, but there are no legal ways for them to arrive. And we have entire industries, care work. There is no visa for care work in the United States. But if anyone who lives in a city, you probably know that much of care work is done by immigrants. And depending on what city, they may be from a different country, there may be more Africans, there may be more Latin Americans, more Mexican or Central American, but it tends to be a niche in the economy that is very immigrant rich. But there are no visas for care work, right? There's very limited numbers of visas for construction, for temporary work. By the way, a lot of the foreign students that you see, we have a small number of visas for people to come. By the way, last time we changed our visa system was in 1990. 1990 is 34 years ago. Am I doing the math right? Yes, 34 years ago? Yes? Okay. 34, look at someone, Jim, who actually has run businesses and knows these things. 34 years ago, right? 34 years ago was a different economy, right? So we have, for example, H-2B visas, which are low-wage work, construction, seasonal work in everything but agriculture. So it includes a lot of people who work actually in like ski resorts, for example. I mean, a lot of the foreign-born young people you see probably on H-2B visas, 66,000 of these. A friend of mine named Michael Clemens, who's an economist, went out to try and figure out how that number was calculated. He managed to find 2 Republican and 2 Democratic staffers who had been part of drafting the bill. Not one of them could remember where 66,000 came from, right? It was a political negotiation in the context of the economy of 1990, but has very little to say about the economy of 2024, right? We don't have legal paths. So first thing, policies in terms of actually matching supply and demand, not great. And you can run down Germany, just tried to change its immigration laws. I mean, we were in Germany 2 weeks ago. And I mean, they're actually trying to fix this, but they've also realized that they have all sorts of barriers to actually recruiting. I mean, they on paper changed everything, but they have all sorts of qualification barriers that make it hard for people to change things. We're all dealing with this, right? All the countries that people want to go to where there are labor shortages, we're dealing with the fact that we haven't kept up with the demands of our economy. We also have an asylum system in this country that was designed for a small number of people who needed protection, who were running from persecution. And so it has a very broad entry point. The first filter is very broad because the idea was giving people the benefit of the doubt because there were a handful of people who would apply for asylum a year. But it turns out that when you've got, say, a couple million people coming to the border in a year, and most of them have now learned that we have an asylum system and it's a good idea to say that you need protection, it's pretty easy to get into the filter. And look, no blame to people who do that. We would all do the same thing, right? I mean, it's a perfectly rational behavior, but it's a system that's made to crash, right? It's a system in the current environment doesn't function, right? So asylum has become a way that people are able to use to actually stay in the country while their case is heard. And the case will no longer be heard for 4 or 5 or 6 years, some cases 7 years at this point. So it has become a labor pathway de facto, which is not what it was designed for. And at the same time, for people who are actually running for their lives, and there are a number of them, not the majority, but there are a number of them, they also are not getting asylum, right? Those people actually have no way of knowing that they're not going to get sent back to the country where they might be killed. So it has become a dysfunctional system. We'll come back to fixes in a bit. I'm trying to leave you with the depressing part. We'll come back to the optimistic part at the end. You know, and if you've ever spent time on the border looking at immigration, one of the things you also find out is everything in terms of border enforcement is geared towards Mexican men. Who, in fact, Mexican men, you know, were the people that were coming 15 years ago to the US border. But right now you're dealing with people coming from 140 different countries. You're dealing with lots of families, lots of unaccompanied minors. And so there are no facilities set up. Now, they've done a little bit of adjustments in the border agencies, particularly in Border Patrol, to try and deal with that. But generally speaking, the resources available and the repertoires that they have are not set up for the kind of people that are coming today. They're set up for another era, which creates all sorts of perverse incentives as well and huge problems, both for migrants as well as for figuring out how to manage the border. Okay, we're going to go in Act 3 here, which is to say, does immigration still remain? I gave you this optimistic look. Is immigration still an important part of America? And it turns out it is. Even with all the dysfunction, it turns out that immigration is actually, immigrants have higher employment rates than non-immigrants in this country. Very significantly so for men, but also for women, actually. It turns out that immigrants are 90% more likely to start a business than the native-born, 90% more likely, almost twice as likely to start a business. And this holds for across nationalities and between low-income and high-income immigrants. It's a little more for some groups than others, but there is no immigrant group that I've seen, I've gone through the numbers for a number of them, there's no group I've seen that has a lower business creation rate than native-born Americans. Now, some of this is self-selection because immigrants tend to be people that pick up and move across a border. Some of this is exclusion. Immigrants who had some standard of living where they left, maybe they had a profession, maybe they ran a business, get to the US and they start over. And they realize the one way they can get back to being in the middle class is to start a business, right? They're never going to become a lawyer again. They're never going to become, a pharmacist. They're never going to become a doctor, but they could become a small business person and reclaim their status and their lifestyle. So there's some part of it is exclusion, but some part of it is self-selection, right? I mean, immigrants tend to be people that take a lot of risks on the way. It turns out that about 25% of patents, 1/4 of patents in the United States are filed by groups of inventors that have at least one immigrant member. 25%. There's a great book by a professor at Wharton that just came out like about 3 or 4 weeks ago. We did the book launch for it, by a professor named Zeke Hernandez, who's absolutely fascinating himself, and he writes his own personal story in this. So you can actually read a lot about him too, which is really fun. And he starts off the book by saying, it will be hard for you to figure out if I'm a Democrat or Republican, a liberal or conservative. And by the end of the book, and I've known him for years, by the way, I still don't know the answer to this, which makes it great because it's not an ideological argument. It's an argument of an economist trying to understand, who studies business, trying to understand how immigration fits into American society. He takes apart why immigrants are so entrepreneurial and why they're involved in so much innovation. And he has some great stories behind it, which I'm not going to tell you because they're his stories, but read the book. It's a fun read, actually. Immigrants tend to be healthier. Second generation, not as much. Second generation turns out to be the same as the rest of us. I'm second generation, so you can see the size here. My mother got the healthy side, me not as much. Children of immigrants, turns out, move up educationally and in income faster than children of the native-born, starting at the same level. So it turns out kids of immigrants are doing really well. Almost the entire growth in the US labor force since 2000 are immigrants and children of immigrants. And about half of labor force growth right now is immigrants, but by 2034 it'll be close to 100%. Immigrants commit crimes at a far lower rate than the rest of us. So any of you who are immigrants here, congratulations. If you want to be safe, move into an immigrant-rich neighborhood. It turns out immigrants, whether they have legal status or not, commit far fewer crimes. I just actually spent a couple days buried in the literature on this, and it's really quite phenomenal. There are multiple studies on this. This is not true everywhere in the world. In Europe, the evidence is actually much more mixed. We've tried to do some looking at this in Latin America. Latin America is more like the US. So it's not like it's a law of any sort, but it just happens empirically. Immigrants in this country, and people looked at for unauthorized immigrants, they looked at for immigrants in general, commit far fewer crimes than native-born Americans. So, I mean, there are probably lots of reasons. One of them is the US is an easy labor market to move into. People are highly employed. There aren't incentives to do other things to make money. But for whatever reason, immigrants have very low crime rates in the United States. And neighborhoods where immigrants move in, crime rates tend to actually go down relative to other nearby neighborhoods. And by the way, immigrants are paying a lot of the taxes the rest of us aren't because we're aging, right? And so very significant in terms of the solvency of Social Security and public services in general. However, and there is a however here, in the short term, oh, and by the way, immigrants over time end up, if you add in their kids, tend to pay more in taxes than they take out in services. Great thing. However, and here's the however, when large numbers of people come in, and we've been seeing a couple million people probably coming across the border. The numbers are inflated of encounters because there's some multiple people, but then there's some people who get around it. So let's say there's a couple million people a year. You are seeing real strains on schools, on healthcare services, on housing, in local communities, right? Shelter in the cities that have right to shelter laws. We're seeing this in New York and Denver, right? Not far away. I actually spent some time with the mayor's office in Denver the other day talking about this. I mean, a real challenge, which they've tried to embrace, but it's a real challenge to deal with. I remember at one point, I mean, Lucia knows the elementary school she went to. At one point, the principal of the elementary school is Salvadoran. And at one point, they had a number of kids who came in who were from a country in Central America who didn't know how to read and write in the 4th and 5th grade, right? And a conversation with my wife said, look, this is, my wife was from Mexico, said, look, we're a school that's set up to deal with kids who have low English language skills. We have a teacher in every classroom who helps with kids who don't know English or don't know English well. But I don't know what to do with kids who don't know how to read and write. And do I take the teacher who's supposed to be helping kids learn English off them and then dedicate to those that don't know how to read and write? Those are real strains. And I think we should be honest about that though immigration may have real net benefits over time, and that may still function really well. I mean, even today, it's functioning really well. And by the way, everything I'm telling you, about a quarter of people in the US are undocumented. A little less than a quarter. It's probably gone up now in the last couple of years, but if we look back 2 years ago, it was about a quarter. All these things still hold true. Low crime rates, high employment rates, paying taxes. By the way, even people who are undocumented tend to pay taxes in all sorts of ways. We can talk about that later if you want. All this still holds true. However, the numbers are so vast and so unplanned that it is starting in local jurisdictions to make a huge difference. And for taxes, over time, it's great that people will eventually pay back and in fact pay more than what they take out in services. But in the short term, that doesn't really help you if you're a teacher in a school where a large number of children with low English language ability just showed up and there's no sort of compensating federal dollars to help you with this, right? So we haven't thought through these things. Okay, so what do we do about this? This is now Act 4, the final act, and then we're on our way after that, right? The curtain comes down. So I think there's at least 4 things we need to be thinking about. The first one is we got to fix the legal immigration system. And I'm not ingenuous enough to think that's going to happen tomorrow or that's the first thing that's going to happen. But it is the most important thing, which is to say if we don't have a legal immigration system that brings in people for the jobs that are available, then they're going to find a way of coming in otherwise, right? So beginning to think of what that it doesn't have to be all permanent jobs. Some jobs are better done, like ski resorts are better done as temporary jobs, right? And by the way, people love circular jobs. And some people do, not everyone does, but I've interviewed lots of people who are circular migrants from Central America who come and spend periods in the US who would not want to live in the US. They love living in their country, in their community with their family and making dollars for 6 months a year. That's ideal for them. There are people who want to move to the US. I mean, and there are jobs which can't be seasonal, right? You don't want your doctor to be seasonal. You don't want your nurse to be seasonal, right? Like, I'm sorry, but your pediatrician will not be available for the next 4 months, but if you'd like to make an appointment in June, we'd be happy to take care of you. So we have to have honest conversation, but some construction jobs might be seasonal, right? We can figure it depending on the industry. You don't want your innovators. You don't want Microsoft to bring in people to be working on a major new project and then have them leave after 6 months, right? I think we've mostly figured out this new chip, but unfortunately our 3 scientists need to leave us, right? That doesn't make sense. So there are jobs which need to be permanent immigration, but there are jobs where it makes sense for people to come and go. So not all immigration needs to be permanent, but we do need to have a serious, and by the way, the fact that there's 7 million jobs, I think that was the latest number open, doesn't mean you need 7 million immigrants, right? I mean, there is always some number of jobs that are open. There is some benefit to industry having to adapt in terms of innovation and in terms of technology to meet labor needs through other means. So it's not a one-to-one substitution. But we're just really far off right now. So we have to figure out how we get closer. We also have to figure out what we do with the talent that's already here. We have about 11 million people living in this country who don't have documents, most of whom have been here for more than 10 years, many of whom have been here for more than 20 years. A lot of people arrived in the last couple of years also. That's a slightly different conversation. But for people who've been here for more than 10 years, who are married to an American, who have American-born children, who have been working one way or another, we actually are shooting ourselves in the foot by not figuring out how to give them legal status. And some people actually, within that 11 million, there are people who have temporary protected status, DACA, deferred status for people who came here as young people, and other sorts of legal status. They're waiting for an asylum decision. There's a couple of million of the 11 million who actually have an ability to stay legally for a period of time, but we haven't resolved it in the long term. And by the way, some undocumented people are incredibly successful. I know at least a couple people who are undocumented, unauthorized, who have formal businesses, at least one of them, who have formal businesses, who are successful, who hire American workers, who have business licenses, who actually are, not only contributing the way we all contribute a daily job, but actually have been out there creating jobs for multiple people, right? So figuring out how we bring people out of the shadows who've been here for long, and we can argue about whether it's 10 years or it's 20 years or it's you show employment over a certain number of years or it's having a US citizen child. We can argue about what the right criteria is, but at some point, people who've been contributing and who aren't gonna leave, rather than scaring them and trying to get them to leave, we should figure out how we bring them in to the economy, because it's better for us. I mean, yes, it's better for them too. It's a nice thing to do, but it's better for our economy, right? That people actually can be more productive and take advantage of their skills, right? And live with some security. Secondly, we need to reform our protection system. Some of my friends on the left hate it when I say this, but the asylum system, in fact, has become a pull factor for people. And the reality is we can't have an asylum system that neither gives protection to people who need it, nor makes a decision on people who probably don't need protection, but then see it as an avenue to be able to stay, right? So what it should be is a system of protection that is fair, fast, and final. That we give people decisions in some sort of real time. That the decisions are fair, that there are clear criteria, and that they're final. And if people don't succeed, they're removed back to their home country. Oddly enough, fair, fast and final is a term that UNHCR uses, the UN Human Rights High Commissioner for Refugees. So I did not invent that one. They actually agree with this. I mean, we need a protection system that actually makes decisions. We have a couple million people right now in the backlog of immigration courts. A large percentage of that is asylum. Not all of it is asylum, but we have a very large backlog on asylum. That just makes no sense. And we frankly should be figuring out how to give people protection closer to where they live. This administration has actually tried to do that, I think in a creative way, although a little too late, but they have tried to do it, which is they've created these safe mobility offices to try and vet people in Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Guatemala for protection needs. So they don't have to get to the border if they want to seek protection. They can actually apply for protection somewhere closer to where they live, which is much more fair, by the way, and takes pressure off the border. We also need to think seriously about cooperation with our neighbors in the hemisphere and in other countries. For one thing, because you've got a lot of countries in this hemisphere hosting displaced population. You've got 200,000 people, almost 300,000 recently displaced from Nicaragua living in Costa Rica. You've got almost 3 million Venezuelans living in Colombia. Again, I ran through all those numbers. You've got a lot of Venezuelans. You've got about 500,000 Haitians living in countries in South America and in Mexico. The more we help those countries host those populations, the less likely they are to come here. And the more likely they are to have dignified lives where they are already. So it's good from sort of a self-interested perspective as well as being the morally right thing to do. It's always nice when those things line up. Think of Latin America and the Caribbean as a sponge rather than a wall, that actually people, sometimes don't want to get to the US. They sometimes are happy to stop somewhere along the way, but if they can't achieve a dignified life there, they're going to keep going. So the more we help people have a dignified life in the first place they stop, that's a good thing. We also need to think about things like visa policy. How do we coordinate it? Increasingly, there's more coordination going on, and there's a forum called the Los Angeles Declaration that has sort of helped some of these conversations happen. Let me finish by saying, again, I'm not ingenuous enough to think that we're going to start by fixing all of this. I'm pretty sure that the first thing that's going to happen is what we saw in January with this bill that Langford and Murphy, Senator Langford, Senator Murphy put together, Senator Sinema put together, just dealing with the border. The reality is we're not going to have a conversation on visas until we have a conversation on numbers going down. And numbers have gone down. We talk about why that is right now. The administration's kind of done some fancy work to try and get around the lack of legislative progress. The numbers have gone down, but it really has to be Congress that does that. And I'm pretty sure that's the first order of business. But hopefully the second order of business at some point is figuring out our visa system. And hopefully the third order of business is figuring out what we do with people that have been in this country for a long time and have close ties. Those are all things that make eminent sense. And they make eminent sense not because they're good for migrants. That's a good thing too, by the way. And for those who are migrants, have worked with migrants, the passion to help migrants is a very good thing, and to see people's journey and our own experience is a very good thing. But actually self-interest matters, right? Ultimately, policy has to have an anchor in national interest as well, and in national values. And ultimately, immigration in this country, as it is in most countries, but especially in this country, is about self-interest. It's about innovation, it's about entrepreneurship, it's about economic competitiveness. And we need to figure out how we return immigration. It's about actually fiscal solvency in this country as well, I should say. Ultimately we want to get back to a conversation about immigration that is not just about the border and numbers and who's coming, but about what sort of immigration do we want? How do we encourage legal immigration in the sectors we need, at the levels we need and can absorb? How do we make sure that people who've been here a long time can take some part in that as well? And how do we discourage from people coming in an unauthorized way? And those are actually not contradictory parts. They're all parts of the whole. And this is ultimately not an issue that Americans are that divided on. Politicians are really divided on this, and they're hell-bent in trying to fan the flames on this. But it is actually where most Americans are in terms of their opinion today. So thank you.
So, Dr. Seal, you gave us a great deal to think about.
Yes.
The first question I'd like to ask you is really related to misconceptions there might be out there. Our media might in part be responsible for that, about immigration. What are those major misconceptions? Is there anything we can do about that? How do we get people educated that those are misconceptions?
That's hard to do. I mean, I think the biggest misconception is on immigration and crime, right? Because it tends to be when an immigrant commits a crime, there's some reference to their nationality, right? And if they're unauthorized, there's some reference to that. I mean, rarely do we say, he was a native-born, right? This was a heinous crime committed by a native-born American. I mean, that sort of seems superfluous, right? But we do point it out when someone is not a native-born American, right? And when their status is different. So it suddenly seems like it's outsized, right? Because but in fact, the numbers tell us, and there have been just endless numbers of studies on this at this point. I mean, it's just very consistent. In the United States, immigrants are much less likely to commit crimes. It's particularly true actually on violent crimes, much less likely. And again, it's not a universal law. I mean, there is nothing, because looking at the European numbers, which are not as conclusive, but it is really all over the place there. In the United States, it's pretty conclusive. And so I think that's the biggest one. And then I think also on economics, I mean, that generally speaking, immigrants tend to be, economists talk about whether people are substitutes or complements for native-born workers, right? Or any worker, right? When new workers come in, are they substitutes or complements? They're substitutes, they're competing, or are they complements? Most immigrants tend to be complements for native-born workers, right? They're either at the high end, often in science and technology, and they're bringing sort of new skills and new ideas, and a lot of innovation comes out of that. Or they're in sort of the lower wage area, but they're moving into areas like care work or construction, where there's a dearth of American workers, right? Those are areas, and so they become complements. They become the way that, for example, two parents can work because there is someone taking care of the home, or, you can actually build that factory because there are enough workers out there to get it done so that Americans can work in the factory. And so I think that sort of notion of complement, and there's been lots and lots of study of this, and it seems overwhelmingly most of the time, and again, I recommend Zeke Hernandez's book on this, they really are complements rather than substitutes for American workers. It actually makes American workers more productive and contributes, obviously, on the fiscal side significantly.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned that it can take 5 to 10 years when people try to enter the country legally to finally achieve legal status. Why does it take so long and cost so much?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's really hard to get to this country. I mean, I have to say it is, I mean, we have by the way, I didn't mention H-1Bs, which are for high-skilled workers. We also have a cap at 60-some thousand, so about 62,000, 64,000, I forget the exact number. Same range as in the H-2Bs. Again, set in 1990, right? So very hard to get to this country as a high-skilled worker, very hard to get to this country as a lower-skilled worker. Impossible to get here as a worker who wants to work in the care field or a lot of certain areas that have no. So, I mean, first of all, it's very hard to get to the U.S. legally. I mean, that is for most people, it's just not a realistic option out there. For those that make it, which is why people go to the border, right? And if you get to the border, the asylum system has become the way of getting in because we made the filter so broad, I mean, basically, if you have any chance of being persecuted when you return, there's any reason to believe that, they then have to hear your case, which made a lot of sense back in the day when the numbers were small. But right now, if you're talking about 1 million people or 1.5 million people who try and go through that, now it's a very broad filter, right? And we're just not, the US government isn't resourced anywhere close enough to try and handle that. And it's not really clear how you get out of the backlog. I mean, we've recommended trying to deal with new cases first at this point because the backlog is so long. You know, you actually need to start cleaning up the system by dealing with new cases. And my colleague Doris Meisner has recommended that we use asylum officers instead of asylum courts to make decisions on asylum applications. It's a lot quicker. It's a lot more consistent, actually, it turns out. There's been some experimentation in doing this, but it hasn't gone all the way. And the hardest problem with all this is, all this has to be done in legislation. I mean, there are a few things you can take around the margins, but is it easy to get things through the US Congress, by the way? Doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat or independent, right? I mean, you know, whatever your views are. It's just, it is not a finely oiled machine, right, these days. So, you know, when we have to fix systems, you know, it's really hard to do it because so much of this has to come through Congress.
So speaking of Congress, how much would the legislation that didn't pass Congress have helped with the border issues?
I think it would have helped a lot on the asylum side, which is it would have made it, so what they were trying to do is make it a higher standard for asylum if you come between ports of entry. Right now there's an appointment system. If you're willing to wait, and sometimes it can be a long wait in the border for an appointment, you can get an online appointment, you go to a port of entry, and you enter the country legally and are able to apply for asylum in the country. And there's 1,850 appointments a day. If you cross between ports of entry, what they would have done is sort of raise the standard. So there's a presumption that, you know, you do not need asylum because you didn't choose to wait and go through the appointment system. There were still some exceptions for extreme cases, but it would have created an incentive for people to go to the ports of entry. So I think it would have helped with the numbers. It does not fix legal immigration. It doesn't do anything about people already in this country, but it would have been a common sense fix. And it was really interesting because it was negotiated. I mean, Lankford is a real conservative Republican from Oklahoma. Murphy is a really liberal Democrat from Connecticut. And, you know, and Sinema is, you know, sort of a moderate independent. But I mean, this was not centrists coming together to figure this out. This was the old art of politics where real conservatives and real liberals, you know, think Kennedy and McCain, would sit down and talk about things and actually realize that they would give up something to get something bigger, right? Which is how American politics works when it works well. It's not that we all sort of agree on everything. It is that reasonable people can get into a room and eventually hash out something that they think is in the greater good, even though they give up a little bit along the way. I think this would have made a difference. Unfortunately, in our polarized politics, it got blown up by people on both sides who felt that it was giving up too much. And look, in this media, again, one of the other effects of this thing, negotiation is really hard to do these days because everything gets leaked, right? And you know, you have to be able to defend yourself within 30 seconds because, you know, the criticism is coming quickly and they didn't manage to define the narrative others did.
Interesting to think about that impact. Yeah. If Trump wins in the current election, he has laid out a lot of things that he would like to implement vis-a-vis immigration. I know this is kind of a hard question to answer, but can you speculate a little bit about what the local impact might be for us here in Steamboat or in our state of Colorado?
So I'm going to say something that will probably offend everyone in this room for different reasons.
Go for it.
Yes, I'm hesitating here, but you know, Democrats tend not to get the fact that the border matters, right? And that the number of people coming across the border, there's a lot of sympathy and there's a lot of agreement, a lot of understanding that immigration is good for the country, but that if there's a perception of chaos at the border, or in fact real chaos at the border, it will undermine people's faith in the immigration system and their willingness to move forward in other areas on immigration. Republicans in recent years, and there was a time where this was less of a partisan divide. I mean, think George W. Bush, for example. or John McCain. But the Republicans have now moved into a place where they tend to think that all immigration is a bad thing, and they don't really. I don't frankly think that Trump, who was married to at least 2 immigrants, and hired immigrant workers, actually thinks that immigration is evil, right? But I do think it's become, in the same way that Democrats go, all immigration is good. It is, yet we understand people are coming here for, noble reasons, and therefore, we're going to be lenient in how and then sort of lose control of it. Republicans have gone the other way, at least some of the leadership, which is, and certainly with Trump at the lead, of sort of saying we need to bring down numbers, period, and that includes both legal immigration and illegal immigration. And in this case, also talked about deporting people that are already in this country, which, I think is hard to do. For reasons we can talk about more if people want to. It's actually quite hard to deport people that are already living here. What you can do is create a lot of terror. You can create unpredictability, right?
Yes.
And so what you can do is drive people underground because they're not sure if they could be subject to deportation. And I think that could happen. I think you would see it harder for people to come in as temporary workers, very likely, which is ironic because I don't think Trump is personally against temporary workers. He used to hire them, actually, as a business person. But it's become an ideological thing rather than a rational argument. And so I think you may see real labor shortages, And I think you may see, in the same way that Biden administration came in and was very lenient on the border and then sort of started to realize that they had to get a little more disciplined, you might see a Trump administration go very hard on legal immigration, go very hard on enforcement, but at some point realize from the business community that there are real labor shortages, and they actually have to sort of rethink this, and they then pivot also. So,
Which has certainly happened historically with decades ago with former administrations, both Democratic and Republican, where they have had to back up very much.
Exactly. So I don't know. I mean, I think we will see a real pivot. I mean, because Trump has. I don't think we should distrust what former President Trump has said over and over again that he will do on immigration, because I think he will. But I think we might see, it might not last 4 years, right? There might be changes.
Okay, and speaking of historical issues and continuing to the current day, to what degree is the U.S. responsible for some of those push conditions in countries where people have left, are leaving, and how is our foreign policy harmed our, particularly I would say the Northern Triangle neighbors? Yeah,
we don't tend to be a country that has a lot of historical memory, but others do. They remember us better than we remember them.
Yes.
So, certainly in the Northern Triangle, the U.S. played a complicated role, I think is the generous way of saying it, in strengthening authoritarian governments at a time when, there were some hopes, there were some budding hopes for democracy, and we really helped delay it by, not alone, but in tandem with authoritarian groups in those countries, because it was in our interest to keep some control. We saw everything through a Cold War lens. And, Haiti is another country where the U.S. and France and other countries don't have a proud legacy, right? I mean, which is not in any way to, forgive, authoritarian leaders and gang leaders in Haiti that have also made the country a disaster. But historically, there were decision points where a better U.S. foreign policy and more betting on stability and growth rather than what we thought were our Cold War interests might have actually played out better for us in the long term. And these are factors that people are still dealing with, right? People are still leaving these countries because the remnants of authoritarian rule and the economic conditions that resulted are part of their life.
Okay, so you mentioned that immigration rates have actually not changed dramatically over recent decades, and yet we constantly hear about the immigration crisis, as if this is something quite new for our country. Do you disagree with the rhetoric from both sides politically that we are currently experiencing an immigration crisis?
Yeah, so immigration rates globally have changed sort of gradually. In the U.S., they've also changed gradually. I mean, we had very restrictive policies until 1965. After 1965, the numbers started to go up, right? They've gone up over time. We're still a little lower, slightly less than 14% of Americans are born in another country. which is not the highest rate. We got up to a little over 15% in the early 20th century. But it is higher than it was, right? It's certainly higher than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. My mother, who was an immigrant from Denmark, came during the time of low immigration to the United States in the late 1960s. And almost her entire social network were other immigrants from other parts of the world. It was fascinating because a Danish immigrant today would probably pass almost unnoticed, right, in American society. But at the time, there were so few immigrants; it was 4 to 5% of the population. She really saw herself as an outsider in American society. It's now, in this country, it's much bigger than it was, but it's not a crisis. I mean, in terms of immigrants still do credit to American society. I do think we have a border crisis, however, which is a different thing. I mean, I think we have a border management crisis, which is, it's a crisis of institutions. And we bring in about 2.5 million people, give or take, legally each year for work and study. So 2.5 million people that come in a semi-permanent way. Some of them are on technically temporary visas or student visas and will go back, but people are coming for a large period of time and earning money or studying. And we have maybe a couple million people, give or take, who are coming across the border unauthorized. That's a little too close, right? I think there's a crisis of credibility of institutions when you see that. When it was 500,000 people that came unauthorized, 2.5 million people came legally, say mostly a system works, but we have to figure out this other part. We've gotten painfully close to a place where it's hard to say to Americans with a straight face that people are coming in an organized way. But the problem's not the immigrants. The problem's the system. The immigrants who are coming in are probably going to do pretty well. I mean, that's the sort of tricky thing here is, and why I tend not to talk about sort of immigration crisis. They're going to do pretty well. I mean, their kids are going to do even better. And, they're going to start businesses. They're going to renew American society. Their kids will be patriotic Americans. I mean, this is, immigration works really well in this country, even though our systems don't work well. But our systems are at a breaking point.
So, also about the border, a number of people have voted for this question. Is it possible to have an open border or an open, more fluid border for workers, but to be able to somehow really crack down on drug trafficking and human trafficking and the other issues that are really negative in people coming through the border, negative things, negative people?
It's hard to do it. I mean, it's interesting. Actually, organized crime, for another part of my life, I worked a lot on organized crime issues. And, drug trafficking actually goes through different routes than immigrant arrivals, right, than unauthorized immigrants. I mean, generally, most drug trafficking goes on through ports of entry. People do not, run through the desert with cocaine on their back, okay? I mean,
Not in any quantity, anyway.
Not in any quantity, no. I mean, maybe a personal, supply tucked in their pocket, but it would be a lousy business strategy because you lose, you lose a backpack. You lose a backpack of marijuana, who cares, right? It's a low, revenue drug. But if you lose a backpack full of cocaine, someone's going to shoot you in the head. In fact, a bunch of people get shot in the head. So cocaine and meth and fentanyl mostly move through ports of entry in trucks and cars, right? And there's a cat and mouse game to try and figure out, they keep coming up with better ways of detecting this, and the smugglers keep finding other ways of hiding this, actually. And we actually have a project where we're working on ports of entry, which is really not about immigration, but it's a passion of a few of us. And it's fascinating to see how they've been trying to fix this, but the smugglers keep figuring out other ways of hiding things. And so they come through different routes. However, the connection isn't like if you've got lots of immigrants coming through, maybe they're carrying drugs. That's, if anything, they're carrying marijuana. And frankly, we produce enough marijuana in this country at this point that, marijuana coming from elsewhere doesn't matter that much. But for better or worse, but, it is, we kind of grow our own. But it is true that border agencies have to deal with both, and they're stretched. And so when they get stretched in the direction of immigration, they often don't do as much on the detection side of illegal substances. And so there is a bit of there is a connection, but it is not the connection that most people think originally. But I don't know about open borders. in some ways, those of us who are sort of inspired to be cosmopolitans, I mean, it sounds lovely to have open borders, but in reality, that would create enormous movement of people back and forth. And so, and look, great things have been done in the name of the state, in the name of countries, in the name of patriotism, in the name of, I think we should assume that borders are here to stay and that countries will regulate who comes in. And it's good for that, and that's good. That's actually probably the most healthy way, is for countries to regulate who comes in. There are actually a lot of agreements in the world for free mobility. Europe, right? Anyone who's traveled across Europe, it's wonderful. You don't have to get there an hour before your flight to another country because it's not crossing the international boundary, right? Yeah. I mean, there's free mobility. It's great. People can move to another country and work. But this happens among countries of similar economic development levels. It's true in South America. There's 2 arrangements in South America. There's 1 in the Caribbean. There's 3 in Africa. I mean, countries of similar economic level have free mobility, but it's probably hard to do when the inequalities are so great.
So our time is more or less up here. So as a last, not question, but I'll just ask you, do you have anything that you want to add that didn't come up in the questions or you didn't have a chance to discuss in your talk?
I don't think so. I think the one thing I would love to leave people with is that immigration is one of the great assets we have in this country.
Well, that's a wonderful point to end on. Yes.
It is. It's one of the great assets. And then we talk about it as a problem, and there are problems. And right now there's some, I think it would be dumb to say, let's not talk about the problems, because there are problems and we need to fix the system. But underneath it all, this is one of the big assets we have. So we want to fix these problems, not because there are problems, but because if we can fix these problems, we've got a big asset here that we can really take advantage of.
Well, thank you so very much.